I'm Courtney Barnes, and right now, I'm watching the fallout crash over my family like a wave they never saw coming. Their voices blur into the same frantic noise: accusations, panic, disbelief, all circling back to me. The daughter they swore would never amount to anything, the sister they assumed would always stay quiet. But none of this is sudden. None of it is random. This moment, this unraveling, started long before anyone realized. It started with a number that wasn't just unfair, but deliberate. A number meant to push me out, to remind me of my place, to make sure I understood exactly who held the power. It started with someone who believed control was permanent, who thought raising the stakes would keep me trapped. Someone who had been tightening the grip for years without expecting resistance. They thought I'd fold the way I always pretended to. They thought I'd take the hit, swallow the humiliation, and disappear like an afterthought. They didn't understand what had been building in the quiet, the calculation, the preparation, the truth waiting under everything they mocked. Standing here now, watching the consequences ignite around them, I can feel the exact moment the story changed. The exact moment their certainty cracked. They still think they know what this is about. They think it's just the rent, just a disagreement, just another family argument spiraling out of control. They're wrong. What happened that night didn't happen because of the number they threw at me. It happened because they forgot who I'd become while they weren't paying attention. And if they're shocked now, they have no idea what's coming next. CTA. Before I dive into what was said that night and what followed after I walked away, tell me, what time is it where you are, and where are you watching from? I want to see how far this story reaches. A quieter memory pushes forward, as if my mind knows exactly where the unraveling truly began. I grew up inside a house where certainty had already been assigned. One daughter built to shine, one daughter meant to orbit around her. Monica Barnes stepped into that role long before either of us understood what it meant. I remember the way her confidence filled every corner, how she carried herself like someone waiting to be applauded, how every room adjusted to her presence. I learned early that I was expected to adjust too. I didn't resent her then. I didn't have the language for resentment. What I had was a steady awareness, an understanding that attention naturally tilted toward Monica, and whatever remained would eventually reach me. People around us responded to her with ease, as if admiration was simply the correct reaction. I stayed in the background because that space seemed already prepared for me, quiet and predictable. There were days when she moved through the house with a rhythm I envied, certain of her place in the world. I watched her collect approval with no hesitation. I watched her take on responsibilities that seemed designed for her strengths. I watched how effortlessly she fit into expectations. I learned to keep my head down, convinced my presence needed to be small to avoid disrupting the balance we were told to maintain. While she thrived in competitions, clubs, and celebrations, I built a private world no one cared to enter. Numbers steadied me. Patterns made sense. Quiet tasks, projects that absorbed my focus, were where I felt myself open instead of shrink. But none of it carried weight in the hierarchy forming around us. Every unspoken comparison drew the line deeper. One daughter destined for admiration, one destined to comply. I adapted without protest, moving along the edges of family conversations, waiting for moments that rarely came. When I worked on anything, I carried the sense that it belonged behind closed doors. My efforts felt safe only when unseen. I shaped myself around that belief until it felt natural, the way some people learn to breathe through shallow air. Growing older didn't shift the dynamic. If anything, it sharpened it. Monica's success seemed to accelerate with time, widening the distance between us in ways I never questioned. I assumed it was normal for her achievements to be broadcast while mine faded before being acknowledged. What mattered to me didn't matter to them. and I convinced myself it didn't need to. Still, there were brief flickers, small moments when something inside me resisted being dismissed. When I finished a project that made me feel capable. When I caught a glimpse of momentum in the skills I was building. When it became clear my quiet focus held a value no one else recognized. Each moment was fleeting, swallowed by the larger narrative that had already been written for me, but the impressions stayed. They settled like seeds under the surface, waiting. Monica continued forward with her practiced certainty. She made decisions quickly, took control easily, stood in positions where authority seemed obvious. I learned to anticipate her confidence before she even spoke. It became a predictable pattern. She led, and I stepped aside. Not because she demanded it directly, but because every message around us suggested that was the natural order. For a long time, I didn't challenge it. I didn't imagine an alternative. I accepted the version of myself that fit the family's expectations: quiet, adaptable, unthreatening. That version lasted years longer than it should have. I didn't understand how much it limited me until something shifted far beneath the surface, so subtle I barely recognized it at first. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't ambition. It was simply the growing awareness that the space I had settled into wasn't meant for me anymore. My silence felt heavier. My patience felt worn. The roles we had inherited no longer made sense the way they once did. And in that slow unraveling, a quiet understanding formed. Stepping aside had never protected me. It had only taught everyone else to assume I would. That realization didn't erupt. It spread slowly, the way a shadow lengthens across the ground when the sun moves without anyone noticing. By the time I recognized it fully, the foundation under our roles had already shifted. Something in me had begun to ask a different question, one I wasn't ready to speak aloud but could no longer ignore. A gentler shift in my memory brings me to the person who altered the direction of my life without ever demanding anything from me. My Aunt Elaine Foster carried an ease that felt foreign compared to the tension at home. She moved through her days with a quiet steadiness, as if she had already survived enough storms to understand what deserved her energy and what didn't. I was drawn to that steadiness long before I understood why. Whenever I stepped into her presence, something inside me relaxed, not because she tried to comfort me, but because she didn't require anything from me at all. Elaine noticed things without announcing it. She paid attention to the small shifts most people overlooked: habits, patterns, the way someone held themselves when they thought no one was watching. I didn't have to explain the silence I lived in. She read it easily, as if it were a language she already spoke. Over time, her townhouse became the one place where my mind felt unguarded, where I didn't have to calculate how much space I was allowed to take. She introduced me to a world I had only brushed the edges of. It began with scattered documents on her coffee table: mortgage statements, depreciation schedules, old closing packets. She would let me leaf through them without comment, trusting I would return whatever I didn't understand. Each page opened a corner of a landscape I hadn't known existed, one built not on approval, but on ownership. She treated information the way other people treated heirlooms: handled with care, shared only when earned. Eventually, she started bringing me along to weekend open houses. Those afternoons felt like stepping into an entirely different life. I watched agents describe future possibilities with practiced optimism, while potential buyers traced the edges of the rooms with a hunger that had nothing to do with decor. Elaine stood quietly in the background, absorbing the mechanics instead of the performance. I followed her lead, noticing the unspoken elements: how prices reflected confidence, how hesitation revealed itself in posture, how control shifted with whoever held the paperwork. She explained concepts slowly, never pushing me toward praise or validation. It wasn't about admiring the properties, it was about understanding the structure beneath the surface. I began to see how ownership shaped decisions, how the person holding the deed always dictated the terms, how authority flowed toward whoever understood the system well enough to navigate it without fear. Something settled in me as those realizations grew. For the first time, my mind felt connected to a path I hadn't known I was allowed to take. Elaine never compared me to anyone. She valued the way I processed information, the way I noticed details that didn't announce themselves. She treated my strengths as practical tools instead of curiosities. That quiet validation reshaped me more than encouragement ever could. It gave me permission to expand, rather than reduce myself to fit whatever space remained. But underneath her calm, I eventually sensed a shift. There were evenings when her energy dropped unexpectedly, when she paused before standing, when she sank into her chair with a tiredness that didn't match the usual rhythm of her days. She didn't explain it, and I didn't press. Still, the change pooled between us, unmistakable and unspoken. One afternoon, she asked me to sit with her at the dining table. The air carried a stillness that warned me something irreversible was unfolding. She placed a folder in front of me, a plain object that suddenly felt heavier than anything it contained. Inside were investment statements stretching back years, evidence of choices she had made long before I was old enough to understand them. She had built a reservoir of stability piece by piece, trusting only herself to maintain it. When she told me it belonged to me now, something inside me staggered. I wasn't prepared for the weight of what she offered. $300,000. The number didn't feel real. It represented decisions made with foresight I hadn't yet earned. She didn't frame it as a reward or an obligation. It was an opportunity, one she believed I would recognize when the time came. Her instructions were simple. Keep it private, use it wisely, and build a life not dictated by anyone else's expectations. She spoke with a clarity that left no room for doubt. She wasn't giving me money. She was handing me a foundation. Not long after, her health declined with a speed that felt both sudden and inevitable. I stayed close, moving through her home with the quiet urgency of someone trying to memorize a place before it disappeared. When she was gone, the silence she left behind was nothing like the silence I had grown up with. This one was shaped by loss, not invisibility. It pressed into me with its own gravity, forcing me to stand in the space she had prepared for me. I didn't know then how far her influence would reach, or how sharply it would contrast with everything waiting for me outside her walls. I only knew that something essential had shifted, and there was no returning to who I had been before. A new shift arrived quietly, marking the point when control in our family rearranged itself without debate. When Monica Barnes stepped into her role as the responsible one, the transition felt almost rehearsed. She carried the confidence of someone who expected doors to open before her, and the world responded accordingly. Becoming a realtor didn't change her, it amplified her. She moved with a polished certainty, speaking as though every decision she made was the natural continuation of an unspoken plan. No one questioned her competence. No one questioned her authority. And soon, the rest of us stopped questioning the way she absorbed responsibility without asking. My move into the duplex happened under the premise of practicality. It was framed as a solution, a manageable place with shared family history, maintained under Monica's guidance. I accepted it because it seemed stable, predictable, and detached from the strain I felt elsewhere. I told myself it would be temporary, a pause while I figured out what came next. I didn't realize how quickly temporary situations could harden into something restrictive. At first, Monica's involvement appeared harmless. She introduced new systems, structured arrangements, detailed schedules. Her language took on a professional crispness, shaping the environment around rules rather than relationships. She treated management as a job rather than a family responsibility, and that distance made it harder to challenge her. I followed the expectations because they seemed reasonable, but each one narrowed the space I believed I occupied freely. Then her approach shifted. The rent she set for my unit exceeded anything typical in the neighborhood. She justified it through market terminology, invoking trends and demand curves as if the numbers validated themselves. The justifications didn't matter as much as the underlying message. She held the authority, and I was expected to comply. The imbalance grew gradually, cloaked in administrative language that pressed against me without ever raising its voice. Monthly reminders became memorized rhythms. Emails arrived with timestamps precise enough to feel intentional. The tone resembled correspondence from a detached property manager rather than a sister. The phrasing was rigid, efficient, stripped of anything resembling consideration. Fees appeared for maintenance I hadn't requested. Charges surfaced for routine wear she insisted fell under my responsibility. When internet access vanished one evening without warning, I recognized the shift for what it was, a method of asserting power through inconvenience. There was no confrontation. There didn't need to be. The message sat beneath every interaction. She controlled the structure, and I occupied it at her discretion. The dynamics of our childhood repeated themselves in a new form, one built on policies instead of comparisons. This version carried sharper edges because the consequences reached into my ability to live, work, and maintain stability. Her authority extended beyond emotional space. It seeped into practical necessities. My parents accepted her system without hesitation. They admired her initiative, her professionalism, the polished certainty she presented. They repeated her explanations as if they were facts, not interpretations. Discussions about the duplex always tilted in her favor, shaped by their unwavering belief that she acted with clarity and competence. I didn't try to correct them. Their trust in her was absolute, and challenging it felt futile. Meanwhile, something tightened inside me. The pressure wasn't loud, it was steady, accumulating in layers I rarely acknowledged. Each decision Monica made carved out another small boundary. Each consequence reminded me how precarious my position had become. I managed my obligations, adjusted my budget, and adapted to the structure she imposed because I had little choice. But a quiet tension built beneath those adjustments, subtle enough to overlook until it became impossible to ignore. I moved through my days with a growing awareness of how dependent I had become on a system that wasn't designed to support me. The duplex, once a temporary refuge, felt increasingly like a framework designed to keep me contained. Monica's efficiency masked a deeper intention, or perhaps an instinct, to maintain control without appearing overt. She didn't need to raise her voice or assert dominance directly. The policies she crafted achieved that on their own. I didn't recognize the accumulation of these moments as a turning point. Not then. I only felt the weight of living within a structure someone else had engineered, one that left little room for autonomy. I lived inside rules I hadn't created, in a home that no longer felt like a place I occupied freely. It would take time before I understood that this stage, this quiet compression, was the beginning of the shift that would eventually reshape everything. A quiet reorientation began when my work life shifted into something more deliberate. Natalia Torres entered my orbit during a period when my days blurred together under the weight of obligations I couldn't fully name. She carried an energy that didn't intrude, but anchored, measured, precise, and entirely unfazed by the uncertainty that often unsettled me. Our conversation started with small frustrations about logistics, timing, projects that refused to cooperate, but gradually opened into something more revealing. She understood patterns instinctively, noting inefficiencies and loopholes with an ease that mirrored the way I read data. In her presence, my thoughts aligned without resistance. Natalia recognized potential before I admitted it existed. She encouraged me to refine the tools I built, small systems that tracked workflow, performance, forecasting, work I created out of necessity rather than ambition. She saw value where I saw survival. Her perspective steadied me, offering clarity where the world around me felt increasingly constricted. When she suggested forming a company, it didn't land as ambition, it landed as inevitability. She framed it as a step toward autonomy, not accomplishment. That distinction mattered more than I realized. Creating Data Horizon LLC felt like opening a locked room inside myself. My skills expanded into structures with definition, purpose, and direction. I funneled the investment Elaine had entrusted to me into the foundation: software, testing, prototypes, small marketing pushes. Each decision felt like honoring a promise I hadn't fully understood when she made it. The company grew quietly, one client at a time, accumulating momentum without drawing attention. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady. Something I could build without shrinking to fit anyone's expectations. Our early contracts introduced me to patterns that aligned with my curiosity. I analyzed property management systems, tenant workflows, vacancy algorithms, repair schedules, data that revealed how control operated in residential spaces. The numbers were neutral, but the implications weren't. They outline the distance between fairness and manipulation, compliance and pressure, autonomy and reliance. The work clarified dynamics I had been living under without fully recognizing. The turning point arrived through coincidence rather than intention. While reviewing information for a prospective client, I encountered a name tied to the duplex where I lived, a name that didn't belong to Monica Barnes. My breath stalled at the discrepancy, the way a misplaced detail signals something deeply wrong. The registration records traced ownership to a separate individual entirely, someone with no connection to our family. Confusion sharpened into tension as I followed the trail further. Natalia noticed my reaction before I spoke. Her instinct for structural inconsistencies guided her directly to the problem. She initiated a title search, pulling documents that aligned with what I already suspected, but wasn't prepared to articulate. Each page revealed another fracture: payments that didn't match the rent I provided, agreements I'd never been informed of, arrangements that circumvented any claim Monica had implied. The difference between what she presented and what existed widened into something undeniable. The truth wasn't a single revelation, but a series of confirmations. Monica had never owned the duplex. She had never been positioned as a landlord. She operated from a place of assumed authority, rerouting responsibility through presentation rather than legitimacy. The numbers aligned into a pattern of calculated advantage, collecting inflated rent, disguising real payments, constructing an ecosystem where she dictated terms without accountability. The structure held together only because no one questioned it, not even me. The discovery didn't spark anger at first. It sparked precision. The mechanics were laid bare. Who controlled what? Who benefited? Who believed they were untouchable? It wasn't the betrayal itself that unsettled me. It was the ease with which deception had passed as competence. That realization pressed against something deeper, a quiet certainty forming beneath the surface. Natalia assessed the findings with the steady calm that defined her. She spoke in terms of opportunity, leverage, strategy. The owner of the duplex, worn down by mismanagement, was willing to sell. The path forward was suddenly tangible, structured, documented, possible. My role shifted from tenant to potential owner in a single conversation, the weight of the opportunity settling into place like a final piece of a long-hidden puzzle. Purchasing the property was not an act of retaliation, it was alignment, moving into a position I had unknowingly been preparing for. The loan approval, the negotiations, the closing process unfolded with methodical certainty. Each step carried the quiet imprint of Elaine's guidance, Natalia's clarity, and my own accumulated resilience. When the deed finalized, the shift felt internal before it became literal. I no longer lived inside the framework someone else controlled. I stood at the center of my own structure, grounded in a truth no one yet knew. Everything that followed was inevitable. A measured calm settled over me once the deed was secured, a calm that felt almost foreign after years of tightening around every decision. But clarity brought momentum, and momentum demanded structure. I shifted my focus towards stabilizing Data Horizon LLC, refining systems that had grown faster than anticipated. Each new contract expanded our reach and pulled me into a rhythm that didn't leave space for second guessing. Progress formed its own gravity. As the company strengthened, so did my understanding of how information moved, what it revealed, what it concealed, and who relied on its opacity to maintain authority. Those dynamics shaped more than business, they shaped perception. And perception was the currency my family had always valued most. Watching my work gain traction created a quiet sense of distance between who they believed I was and who I had become, a distance that widened with every structured decision I made. My sister, Monica Barnes, remained unaware of any of it. She continued navigating our interactions from a posture of default superiority, carried by a certainty she didn't bother questioning. Her behavior didn't change. She assumed my compliance was permanent. The facade she relied on stayed intact because I allowed it to, not because it still held power. That contrast sharpened my awareness of how fragile her constructed dominance had always been. Conversations with my parents during this period exposed a shift I couldn't ignore. Their comments grew more pointed, less patient, as if they sensed movement they couldn't identify. They spoke to Monica with admiration disguised as logic and addressed me with restraint disguised as advice. To them, responsibility appeared in the form of presentation, organized documents, assertive tones, confident claims. Monica performed those markers effortlessly. They didn't question the performance because it fit their expectations. I didn't attempt to correct them. Their assumptions framed the distance I needed. The more they misread me, the cleaner my trajectory became. While expanding our services, I led Data Horizon into developing a predictive tool for property owners, something designed to identify inefficiencies and reduce losses before they accumulated. The project demanded precision and long hours, but the work steadied me. It reinforced the understanding that systems, when designed well, reveal truths people would rather obscure. That alignment between data and reality shaped how I approached everything around me. Owning the duplex required responsibilities Monica never anticipated: oversight, budgeting, negotiations with contractors, financial planning. None of it intimidated me. It grounded me. I documented each decision, tracked progress, and prepared transition plans that positioned the property for long-term stability. Every update strengthened my position and weakened the narrative that had kept me in place for so long. I didn't reveal the ownership change, not even in passing. What mattered wasn't the announcement, it was the structure beneath it. Letting the truth remain undisclosed wasn't secrecy, it was timing, and timing determined impact. As the renovations progressed, the atmosphere at family gatherings shifted. Monica carried herself with heightened confidence, as if anticipating an opportunity to assert control. My parents echoed her energy, speaking with a conviction that resembled certainty more than understanding. They operated from assumptions that no longer aligned with reality, yet they clung to them as if the alternative threatened their balance. The upcoming annual dinner loomed in the background, a tradition that maintained its place in the calendar even as everything beneath it changed. Its approach seemed to intensify Monica's need for attention. She messaged more frequently, issuing reminders disguised as updates, speaking about expectations as if preparing for a performance she believed she had already won. The tone revealed her anticipation. She expected compliance, deference, obedience. What she didn't expect was absence of resistance. I approached the days before the dinner with a clarity that bordered on detachment. My focus rested on logistics, completing the final inspection of the duplex, finishing the last phase of the predictive tool, preparing quarterly reports. Every task reinforced the life I had built independently of their assumptions. The separation wasn't emotional, it was structural. Natalia noticed the shift before I articulated it. She didn't press for details. She recognized preparation when she saw it. Her quiet support allowed the space I needed to think, not react. She understood that silence wasn't avoidance. It was strategy. The night before the dinner, I reviewed the completed documents for the duplex. Ownership felt less like possession and more like alignment with the person I had been becoming. The trajectory from tenant to owner wasn't a transformation. It was a restoration of agency I had long been denied. I closed the binder and felt a steady certainty take shape. Nothing about the gathering would unfold the way Monica expected. Nothing about the dynamic would remain intact. Nothing about the balance she relied on would survive contact with the truth. The structure was already built. All that remained was the moment they finally saw it. A steady breath carried me into the evening that would expose every assumption my family had mistaken for truth. The restaurant felt staged the moment I stepped inside, as if the night belonged to a script Monica had rehearsed until she believed it flawless. Her confidence radiated from the center of the table, sharpened by anticipation. As she arranged papers I instantly recognized as contracts. My parents watched her with pride disguised as objectivity, convinced they were validating responsibility rather than performance. Their certainty hovered over the room like a pre-drawn conclusion. I took my seat without acknowledgement. Silence formed its own boundary, and I let it settle. Monica launched into her presentation with the tone of someone unveiling authority rather than information. She referenced figures, projections, and policies with a practiced ease meant to corner rather than inform. One statement cut through the rest. The new rent, announced with exaggerated clarity, raised to $9,000. She framed it as necessity, structure, fairness. She framed it as inevitable. My parents reacted exactly as she hoped. Approval sharpened into amusement, amusement into dismissal, dismissal into the quiet certainty that I had no ground left to stand on. They evaluated me the way they always had, through outcomes they believed I couldn't influence. I felt neither shock nor anger, only confirmation. When Monica slid the contract toward me, I didn't touch it. I watched the way her expression shifted. First confidence, then confusion when I didn't react within the boundaries she expected. My refusal to reach for the paper unraveled her practiced rhythm, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any confrontation could have. Her projection behind her illuminated each clause, each inflated demand, each attempt to assert ownership she never held. The irony cast its own light across the room. I lifted a folder from my bag with deliberate control. The room quieted before I spoke. I placed the deed to the duplex on the table, positioned directly in front of Monica. The document landed with a sound far softer than its impact. Her breathing changed before her expression did. Everything that followed unfolded without theatrics. My parents leaned forward as if proximity could alter what was printed in ink. The confusion shifting across their faces mirrored the collapse of the framework they had accepted without question. They scanned the pages slowly, unwilling to acknowledge the reality that undermined their certainty. Their narrative had depended on Monica's authority. Without it, their hierarchy dissolved. Monica's reaction didn't come in a burst. It fractured. First disbelief, then panic tightening her posture. Then the dawning realization that her authority had existed only because no one challenged it. The silence that followed held the weight of every assumption that had carried her to this moment. I clarified the facts in measured detail. Ownership, financial responsibility, the legal structure that had never included her. I explained the renovations she hadn't funded, the documentation she had never seen, the payments she had only pretended to route. I didn't rely on emotion. The facts alone dismantled the illusion. The aftermath unfolded swiftly. My parents' disappointment shifted direction, no longer aimed at me, but scattered in confusion that exposed how deeply they had misread everything. Monica's confidence collapsed inward. For once, she couldn't structure an escape. The realization that she could no longer control the narrative tightened every movement she made. There was no victory in watching them unravel. There was only clarity. In the days that followed, distance became unavoidable. My parents attempted explanations that read more like justifications. Monica retreated without grace, unable to reconcile the collapse of her assumed authority with the reality she now faced. Their reactions didn't surprise me. They belonged to a structure that had been failing long before this. What mattered wasn't their response. It was the truth finally settling into place. The duplex grew quiet in the weeks after the dinner, but the quiet felt earned. Each room reflected a choice I had made for myself rather than a choice made for me. Work expanded, stability grew, and for the first time, I moved through my life without shrinking to fit someone else's outline. The lesson wasn't rooted in revenge, it was rooted in reclamation. Power built on perception collapses when confronted with truth. Control maintained through performance dissolves the moment reality enters the room. And sometimes, the only way to change a structure is to step outside of it and rebuild your own. I share this because someone listening might recognize the shape of their own story in mine. Recognition is the first step. Action is the second. Thank you for staying with me through this. If my story reached you, let me know where you're listening from. It still amazes me how far honesty can travel.